I want to do a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that there are some people that are on here that probably know a lot more about this than I do because they've been doing it longer than I have. For example, I know that Jim Stem is there, Mark Snellgrove, Peter Lambrinos, and I can't see all of the names. So there may be other people that are Volvo racers that are actually more knowledgeable than I am about what I'm going to talk about. So that's the disclaimer. I just happen to be able to do this and thought it would be entertaining. I'll also say that, adding more people here. I'll also say that we're intending to continue to do these sorts of things. And this one is the only one that I think will probably be on racing. I have lined up a presentation for you e-people on DJet, and then another one on performance mods. If you know Cameron Luke from Portland, Oregon, Cameron's going to come on with me, and I'm going to sort of interview him. Cameron has sort of taken over from Phil Singer as the performance guru in the street Volvo world right now, and so I've asked Cam to be part of that, and also maybe a fellow from Australia who you may know, who is interested in this as well. So that's where we're kind of head on down the line. If you have any suggestions for things that you'd like to hear about, type it into the chat function and I'll record that and we'll go on from there. But so for right now, let me start to share my screen. So I want to sort of thank Volvo Sports America, VSA, for being the co-sponsor of this. Paul Graziano, who's on here, is the Facebook guru of VSA, and he and I have been talking about doing this for several weeks, and I finally decided it was actually time to do it. We're part of this loose organization called P&B Motorsports. P stands for Perry and B for Bittner, although Bittner is kind of in the background now. Dave Bittner, you will see in a little bit. But I want to just sort of give you an idea about where this all started for me. I'm not a mechanical engineer, I'm not a chemical engineer, I'm not an engineer of any kind. I'm a botanist, and but I've always been kind of a gearhead. And a number of years ago, around 2010, when I was intending to retire, I decided it was time to actually do something to keep me out of trouble, or keep me in trouble, depending on how you look at it. So what I've said is I essentially exchanged the business suit for the racing suit, and I'll just give you a little bit of background on how this all started for me. This is sort of where we're going to be going today in this presentation, and we'll see how it actually goes. In the mid-1970s, I bought an Amazon and moved into Maryland from Wisconsin, and that Amazon rusted completely apart because it was a Wisconsin Amazon. It was a 67, and I bought a body from Modesto, California. And I drove that body back from Modesto all the way to Maryland, a story in itself. And when I got it back, I realized that I could actually get the bolts off without using a blowtorch or oxyacetylene, because it had lived its entire life out in California. And so as a consequence, I decided this was not going to just be a daily driver, which the other one had been. It was actually going to become my first collector car, although I don't think I even knew what a collector car was at that time. I'm going to stop screen sharing for just a second to see if anybody else has joined. Hang on. Looks like we're okay. 31 participants. So in any case, this is the car that I started with. The car no longer belongs to me. It ended up going to Keith Martin in the mid-2000s, the late 2000s, or something like that. I can't even remember. No, it was 2014 or 15, I guess. But this was my first collector car. And because of the business I was in, I got invited to go to Road America for some track days. I was actually a university administrator, and we had these there was a bunch of business associates, and I got invited to go down there. And so I got to drive on Road America in 2008. I was the slowest car on the track, and I was probably the only car that came in on a hook because something electrical went wrong. But anyway, it sort of started my passion for being on a racetrack. Then in 2007, I had purchased an 1800 ES, and this is Dave Bittner, and I also took it to another track day at Road America, and Dave was riding with me, and he said to me as I was throwing it around the track, he said, you know, this car, I put too much effort in this car, because he did all the painting on it, I did all the other restoration. He said, this car is too damn valuable for you to be doing this sort of thing with a car like this. If you're going to do this, why don't you buy a car that's really meant for it? So that sort of started the whole thing off, and I had known Dwayne Matejka from my experience when I lived in Maryland. Dwayne had actually helped me repair the Amazon when I blew a freeze plug on a Saturday evening. So I called Phil Singer and said, hey, Phil, I'm looking for an 1800 race car. Do you know any for sale? And he said, you know, Dwayne Matejka's car is for sale, and he's been trying to sell it for a while, so why don't you give him a call? I said, well, I know Dwayne Matejka, at least I know of him. So I gave him a call, and so in 2010, I bought Dwayne Matejka's car. Dwayne built this car in, I believe it was 1995, 96, somewhere around there. And he campaigned it in the Volvo Historic Series, and he did really, really well with it. And you can see right here on these, on the door, he won 5 consecutive Volvo Historic Series championships with it. And as a consequence, I was pretty happy to get the car. It was an expensive investment. It really wasn't an investment. It was an expensive proposition, but I figured that I had gotten a car that was really meant for what my purposes would be. I had actually had in the barn an 1800 that I had bought as a donor car for the ES's motor, because the ES's motor was shot. It had a cylinder that was bad enough that the block needed to be replaced. And I decided that first of all, I decided I was going to build a race car, and then I decided I didn't know diddly squat about building a race car, so I thought I better buy a race car. And it was certainly the best thing that could have ever possibly happened, that's for sure. So in order to get into the real racing, as those guys that are on here know, who are also racers, you have to go to school. And I chose to go to the Midwestern Council's driving school. Midwestern Council is a Midwest organization that consists of 5 individual clubs. And I participated in one weekend that was a full classroom weekend, and had an exam at the end of it. Wasn't particularly challenging, it didn't seem to me, but it was very well worthwhile. And that was followed up by an on-track class day where I had someone riding with me. And I really feel sorry for the guy that was riding with me, because that was really the very first time I had ever really driven the car. I stayed in 3rd gear around the Black Hawk Farms track the entire time. And Lord knows how it happened, but I apparently passed the session because I didn't hit anybody and I didn't spin. Probably wasn't going fast enough to spin. So this was the actual, what it looked like at that particular time at Black Hawk Farms. And this was in July of 2010. So basically I've been doing it since 2010. This is the 11th year of racing for me. So I'm going to go a little bit through the car so you have an idea of what it looks like and what modifications that have been done on it. 95% of these modifications were done by Dwayne Matejka when he built the car. And I've actually done a few things to, I think, improve it since then. We'll see. Of course, you have to do things for safety, so it has a full fire suppression system with the bottle behind the driver's seat, and it's plumbed to ports that are both in the driver's cockpit and into the engine compartment as well. There's a lever on the dashboard. If I pull it, it says emergency. or fire or something like that, it's red, I know that, it will spray out the contents of that fire bottle. I believe there's actually one in the trunk as well, although I'm not completely remembering. So we have a fire suppression system that's throughout the car. We have an inertial brake fuel cutoff switch. This was something that I added because I learned that even though you have a fuel cell, you roll over, you can still get leakage out of that fuel cell, presumably, and it's best to not have the fuel pump running. It's an electric fuel pump. And then it has a brake delay anti-lock that prevents the rear brakes from locking up if you really jam them on. So this is sort of looking at the trunk of the car. The fuel cell is a 12 gallon ATL fuel cell with a foam interior that presumably prevents things from leaking. We've never had to try it so far. This little device in the middle here is actually our fuel gauge. It's just a rod that sticks down and we pull it up and the fuel evaporates pretty darn quickly, but we try to actually measure how much fuel we've got in it by this little fuel gauge. My wife, who's the race coordinator, has been advocating for me to put in a real fuel gauge because she doesn't like using this thing, and then neither does David Farrington, I don't think, who's on this call. And then, so you see, here's the fuel filter, and here's the electric fuel pump that's coming out of the tank. But the other two items that are shown here are actually the canisters that allow me to change the coilover shocks in the back end of the car. Here, so this side shows the coilover shocks, and so I can actually adjust those shocks for stiffness depending upon the conditions of the track. Now, in reality, about the only time we actually do that is when it's raining, when we need to soften up the rear end of the car so that it has a little bit more traction in the rain. So I'm the one that actually adjusts these. There's just two little rotating devices on these canisters that allow for me to soften or harden the shocks. And David Farrington is the one that crawls underneath the car and disconnects the I guess it's a sway bar or something like that, and to actually add it to the softening. Here's the battery of the car. It's been moved to the back. This is obviously a red top battery, an Optima red top. I'm thinking about getting rid of this because that sucker weighs about 30 pounds, and I've been trying to lose weight for the last 3 years, and I'm not being very successful, especially with COVID, kind of keeping me stationary. I figured the fastest way to lose weight is to put a lithium battery in there, and so maybe we'll do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about changes in the suspension that have taken place. You'll recognize the cross member of the car, but what you can see is that Dwayne has done a whole lot of welding to reinforce this cross member. Obviously the motor's out of it, but this sucker is really, really stiff. It has Delrin bushings instead of polyurethane or rubber bushings in the lower A-arm bolts. Same thing in the upper A-arm as well. You see here's the idler arm. Notice that it actually has a grease fitting, and you probably know that I was selling these things. This is actually one of the early ones. This is not one of the ones that I was selling, but it's got a greasable idler arm as well. Notice here on this right side, you can see the safety wiring. Just about everything on this car is safety wired, and it really takes a lot of time to do this, but I know people that run down in Florida who run an Oldsmobile old stock car in road racing, and he's had a caliper fall off of his car, and he ended up against the wall. You know, it just doesn't make sense to not safety wire everything. I also know a person that actually spent a couple $1,000 spending money on oil dry at Road America because his oil plug came out of his car and he lost 12 gallons out of a dry sump system from his car. So, you know, it just doesn't make any sense to not have everything safety wired. This is the bottom of the shock bracket on the front. Here's the ball joint, the lower ball joint fitting. You'll recognize that, but you can see how this has all been reinforced. Again, this is Dwayne's work. It doesn't look anything like stock. And here is a very large sway bar arm and with about a 1 1/4, 1 1/2 inch front sway bar. So it is really stiff. Adam Pepper, who's on this call, will recognize this because I provided the drawing after Dwayne asked me to send him one, and I think Adam has one on his car just like this. So here you can see the front coilover shocks on the front as well. Those are adjustable, but they're not adjustable with any canisters. Here are the motor mounts, comparing the stock motor mount in black with the race motor mount, which is just essentially reinforced. You'll see that the holes through which the bolts move are reinforced, but on the bottom, a bracket has been welded in to reinforce that as well. So, you know, everything is really reinforced in terms of suspension. I numbered all these things because I wanted to talk a little bit about each one of them, and it's the only way I could even remember what I wanted to talk about. It's a Volvo B20 block and a Volvo B20 head, and that's pretty much what's Volvo about it. The block has been bored 40 thousandths over, the head has been shaved a bit, and the ports have been raised. The combustion chambers have been modified as well. So to improve efficiency, increase horsepower, increase compression ratio, and probably decrease engine life as well. I'm running dual DCO 48 Webers. These are not DCOEs, these are actually the racing version. These came with the car with the real long runners that you see, which apparently are much preferred over the short ones that are more common. But learning how to adjust these Webers has been really a challenge, and there's so-called experts, and then there are people that like to mess with them. Well, we kind of became experts just by virtue of having to do it, because there are just so darn many adjustments that can be made on them. And we finally kind of got it dialed in about 5 or 6 years ago down at Road Atlanta, and ever since then, really haven't messed with them just too much. They change them a little bit based upon the temperature. Sometimes we'll change them based upon relative humidity as well. So in other words, what we'll do is we'll lean them out as the temperature goes up and richen them as it goes down. Reason why we do that is you get more power out of them, but as the leaner you go, as David Farrington would tell you, would attest to, you get too lean and then you have major problems with detonation and losing your engine. This airbox is a custom-made airbox, just an aluminum airbox that fits over the ports of the Webers. It's got an exit in the rear, but it's got an entrance in the front, which is numbered 4. And what I've done is actually put a slide in here to show you, here is where that port goes. This is the passenger side headlight with a screen over it, and then it leads through a duct, the fiberglass duct, into the opening of the airbox. And this provides a little bit of additional air, particularly when we're moving fast. So it adds a bit more air to the carburetors, and we get a little bit more power that way as well. The radiator is a German radiator. I think Dave thinks it actually came from something like a Volkswagen because he recognized it, but it's a very lightweight aluminum radiator, parallel hole radiator. So that's number 5. We have individual AP cylinders for the front and rear brakes, and here's the clutch cylinder as well. So that holds our racing fluid, our blue racing fluid, Ate blue racing fluid, or whatever it might be at the moment. So we have those individual cylinders there. It has a Denso alternator. You'll notice it's on the wrong side. It's the right side for the race car, but it's the wrong side for a street car. A lightweight thing that came out of, I think, a Geo Metro of all things. Again, this was a Dwayne item that he did. This bottle over here is a vapor in oil container. You see it leads from the valve cover, and it also leads from a port that's into the block where the old fuel pump used to be on the B18s and carbureted B20s. So there's a little port on the bottom of this where we can actually drain oil out. I basically know when my engine is starting to go away by how much oil collects in there. And so as long as it's really pretty dry, I'm really, really happy. Let's see. I don't know where 9 is, but I see where 10 is, so I'm not sure what 9 was. I've just maybe missed a number. This is actually the overflow tank for the cooling system. We don't run any coolant other than water and water wetter. That's by virtue of the sanctioning body's requirements. If you put antifreeze in there and you lose your antifreeze, the track gets really greasy, and it causes major problems on the track. So all we're running is water. And so this is essentially a Corvette overflow tank, or a Corvette tank that serves as an overflow, filled about halfway. And if it gets real full, we know that we have a big problem with the motor, because it means it's pushing water out from the motor. There's also a catch tank over here that will catch that as well. The object with racing is to lighten things up as much as possible. The overall weight of the car is 2,270 pounds with a fuel cell about half full and without me in the car. Now that's actually somewhat heavier than the sanctioning body would allow, but it's certainly a lot lighter than the street car would be. But in terms of actually the moving parts, the object is to strengthen and lighten things up as well. This is a forged crawler rod with ARP bolts instead of these studs that were on stock rods. And you can see how short the skirt is on this piston. These are JE race pistons. These are specially made for the car. Each one is made individually, and we get them through Competition Products in Menasha, Wisconsin, of all places. The flywheel is an aluminum flywheel with a replaceable friction surface here. Here's the stock flywheel. I can't remember exactly what this weighs, but it's somewhere around 20 pounds, as I recall. Some of you may actually know better than I do, but I have a tendency to forget these sorts of things. This flywheel weighs 6.6 pounds, and it's not real streetable in the paddock, but I'll tell you what, it really works very well out on the track. This was a flywheel that was originally produced or created by Bob Griffiths from BHP Performance out in Pennsylvania. Bob's a friend of Dwayne's, and you know, he's sort of out of racing now. Now he's into shotguns, I understand. But that's what it looks like. These flywheels have become available. Those of you who know George Swift out in California, one of Jay Leno's guys, George is a Volvo racer as well, and he is producing these flywheels. They look just a little bit different, and they weigh just a little bit more. But if you need a flywheel, George is your go-to guy right now. They're also available from Europe, and I bought a bunch of these for some people a couple of years ago, but George is the places that I would go now. Modifications that have taken place besides those in the engine. This obviously is the exhaust port, and what you can see in the exhaust port of the head is that these ports have been raised pretty significantly from the stock. This is a brass material that has been inserted in here. As far as I know, there's only one place in the United States that does it. It's a place up in the Portland, or no, it's up in the Seattle area. And Phil Singer is the one that actually arranged for this to be done. I would say that the biggest weakness of the Volvo well, there's two big weaknesses of the Volvo P20 motor. One is the head doesn't flow very well compared to most racing heads. So it's a real weakness. And the better you can get this to flow, the better performance that you're going to get from an engine. And the way you do that is you actually essentially raise the exhaust port, or one of the ways you do is to raise the exhaust port. We also have a set of headers that have some fingers in them that we use with heads that don't have this raised port, which does pretty much the same sort of thing. So that eliminates one of the weaknesses of the head of the B20 motors. The other weakness, which we have not really found a solution to, is the clamping force of the head bolts. We're using ARP studs instead of just regular bolts, but the design of the B20 head is just, it was never meant for what we're using it for. And you'll see down here that we're using a Cometic multi-layered head gasket. This is essentially a 3 or 5 part head gasket. that is essentially made out of metal with a very thin coating on it. And because we're running somewhere between 13.3 and 14-to-1 compression, depending upon the engine that we have, the clamping force that we can get out of the head is just really not high enough to prevent loss of the head gasket over time. So eventually that head gasket, this basically goes away, even when using an MLS. As I said, you know, think about like the B20, what was the compression of the B20? Something like 10.5 to 1 or something like that. And we thought that that was high compression. Well, that's nothing compared to this sort of thing. And it just was never really designed for that. So you get a lot out of these sorts of things. And we got an additional 90 horsepower out of this motor. It went from about a 110 to almost 200 horsepower if you were to put it on a dyno. But the cost is that you lose longevity as well. In fact, I just wrote about longevity in the latest issue of VSA magazine, so you'll see a little bit more about that as well. We're running oversized titanium valves, which have their own issues about them. Titanium is not something that you just grind with a normal grinding machine. As I understand it, the grindings can actually be carcinogenic, and as a consequence, people have to be really careful with them. We're using double valve springs or sometimes beehive valve springs. Here's one shown here. I've only broken one valve spring in all the time that I've been racing, and it was a major pain in the butt to change. So we actually designed a tool specifically to change these valve springs, because you do not change these valve springs with a regular valve spring compressor by any means. Went out to AutoZone and bought a valve spring compressor, and I might as well have just thrown it into the garbage because it was absolutely useless. And it's bored 40 thousandths over. All the blocks are bored 40 thousandths over. I'm using I'm trying to use 1975 B20 blocks because they're metric with a heavier main bolts, main caps. But some of them are 73 blocks as well. Here is some modifications that have taken place within the rear end of the car. On the left here is the open differential that you would see on most of our ESs or Es or S's, I guess, any one of our 1800s. And this has been modified by taking out some of the innards here and replacing them with these blocks, which are very tightly machined blocks with very heavy-duty springs in between them. You can just see the spring in yellow in this little tiny gap between that. So this essentially makes what some people would call a poor man's limited slip differential, but it does work really well. Eventually these things do wear out and they have to be replaced, and we've got a bunch of blocks, and I have learned a little bit about rear end repair as a consequence. I'm not completely comfortable with it, but I can do it if need be. Within the car, we have a monitoring system as well, a data logger, that was originally designed to essentially allow me to get better as a driver faster. And I'll say a little bit more about that, but in reality what has happened is we've been really using it to monitor the performance of the car more than the performance of the driver. I think we're just two social little beings, and we like to sit around and gab instead of actually doing the analysis that they do in the big time. So on the transmission tunnel, there's a data logger. David Farrington deals with this ad infinitum, or maybe I should say ad nauseum. So this data logger is just a little computer system. There's a data card that goes into this slot here, and it comes on whenever we actually have the car running, and it will monitor a whole bunch of things, as you will see. This is a speed readout. It would allow me to see lap times if I could read the darn display, but during the bright days, you can barely see it. And it does have some shift lights up here. I can tell when to shift by just listening to the motor. So David has turned off these shift lights. I don't watch those things anymore. They were more of distraction. It has a GPS unit that's mounted on the rooftop, which allows us to monitor speed as we're going around the track. And you can sort of see some of this is the odometer tachometer with a memory function on it. These are all odometer ProCom gauges, oil pressure, water temperature, and fuel pressure as well. So here's what we get from our data acquisition system. What you see here is a satellite view, of Road America. This is our home track, and it has been imposed in this window with some track sectors on it. Again, I can't thank David Farrington enough, because he's the one that really deals with all of this stuff. So here's the sectors, and so the track is broken into different sectors, and we can actually do an analysis of how the car is running and how the driver is doing by sector and by lap. So here is the data that is recorded by lap. You can see this is lap 3. This happened to be the fastest lap. That's why it's actually highlighted here. And here's some more maxima and minima, or maxima over here. But this is what really shows for you. So this sector that we're looking at is essentially the start-finish line start-finish line of the of Road America through turn 1 and down towards turn 3. This is the acceleration, which is constant. Here it shows you the RPM, and it shows you the speed as we are actually approaching. Right here would be right about here. Right about here as we enter turn 1. So right there we were going a little over 120 miles an hour. And then you can see as we go around the turn, it drops off, and then the speed begins to pick up again. So each one of the segments can be broken out, and each one of those traces is an individual lap that we ran. So you can see that there are 3 laps shown here. And what we can do is we can analyze where we were going at that particular time. In other words, what was going on? Was I going faster as I was entering the corner? Was I going slower? And then we actually look at the video that we have in front of us as well, and then we can actually decide whether or not the reason why I was going slower is because I was just being a chicken, or whether there was a car in front of me, for example. And here goes the speed. And also this was when we had a throttle position sensor onto the shaft of the carburetor. So what you essentially see is, mostly in racing, you are either fully on or fully off. Here, it looks like right down in here, probably right down in this region of the track, I was feathering the throttle, maybe getting off of it, getting on it, depends on which segment it is. And you can see that the fastest lap, which was, I think, let's see, I'm not sure which one's fastest, but there were times when I was more fully on the throttle than I was in this one, for example, where I dropped off the throttle for some reason. So that's what basically the data acquisition will show us. Okay, I don't know, somebody's drawing on the screen here. Okay, whatever. So people always want to know what this sort of costs, and it is kind of a sport that you just need to be willing to lay out the money. And some people actually lay out a lot more than this. When I bought the car, I did no negotiation with Dwayne, because I figured that Dwayne was a friend and Dwayne would help me out. So Dwayne said, I have $60,000 in the car and I want $45,000 for it with the spares. And that's exactly what I paid for it. I paid the $45,000. That is a premium price by almost everybody's standards, but I got the car as a consequence of it as well. So I spend about $6,000 on it. I run usually 2 to 3 sets of tires per year, and I run a lot of race fuel. The race fuel for this particular motor is leaded, and it's 116 motor octane. You can't buy it at the track. I get it in 55-gallon drums, and it's necessary to prevent detonation, keep the motor intact. That's why the reason why we have to use this sort of high octane fuel is because we're running this very high compression motor. I've built 3 complete motors after I got the car, and each one of them, starting with a stock motor, has run about $9,000. So, you know, it kind of adds up over time. So the per event average is about $1,200. I'm not doing 5 to 7 events this year. I haven't done 5 to 7 events in the last couple of years, but you know, it's about $1,200 per event when you consider registration and the cost of travel and things like that. I've got a little help, a lot of help from some people. iRoll Motors, Mike Dudek is a supporter. These folks, Google Financial Advisors, are in Wisconsin. They're the ones that are actually our financial advisors, and I sort of talked them into actually providing a bit of assistance. And then I have all of these other supporters as well. I get some race fuel from Sunoco. I get most of my lubricants from ExxonMobil. I am a big supporter of Ed Madek at 123 Ignition USA because Ed has provided the distributors that I use. Competition Specialists are where I get the race engines, and I get usually a discount from them because they say I'm a good customer. At least I pay my bills. Our Sport Engineering is Dwayne Mateka, who is always offering advice. A couple years ago, K&N Filters provided us with a bunch of filters, and Bosch Spark Plugs provides the racing spark plugs as well. So here is the crew. You really do need friends, and I have joked that I can double everybody's salary without even batting an eye because all these folks are volunteers. And he's on the call. This is David Farrington, who is the race engineer. Sue Farrington, who is at most of the races as well now that they're retired. She takes care of windows and cleaning the car, which needs to be done between sessions. This is my wife, Joy, who is the race coordinator. Dave Bittner is the guy who I call the crew chief. Dave doesn't show up so much anymore. He figures that I don't need as much help as I did in the past. And Pam Bittner is sort of what we call the hospitality coordinator. She keeps everybody happy in terms of food and stuff like that. This was at Road America. It was a really beautiful day and a nice session. And we have our own photographer This is Phil Kohler from the Appleton area. So you really do need friends. There are people that we call arrive and drive. These are the people that are very well heeled, who show up at the track and they have a transporter that has brought their car there, and there's these guys that are doing all of the taking care of things on the car between sessions, and these are all the people that are doing it for us. So it does help to have a very supportive spouse. I would have to say, in all honesty, Joy and I have some of our very best times at the racetrack because it seems like we're always really working as a team there, and so it becomes actually a good time for us. Joy actually has been on the track. We have an old BMW as well, and she took a track day down at Blackhawk Farms a number of years ago, and so far I have not been able to get her into a real race car. I'm kind of working on that though. We'll see. So we've gone a lot of places. We've seen a lot of country. We've had a really good time doing this. We've been all over the United States. This is now a little bit dated because this was the last time I updated was in 2017. But you can see that we've done some pretty wide travel. We've had a lot of fun doing it. We've made a lot of friends. This is as much about making friends as it is about racing, to be honest with you. So we've done some wide traveling. It was our intention to go to Portland International this year for the Volvo Nationals again. Haven't decided whether we're going to do that. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with the COVID-19 situation. And it does become addictive. Peter Egan said racing makes heroin addiction look like a vague wish for something salty. I know that David Hipschen uses that as his tagline on his email, and it is absolutely the truth. It becomes something that you really look forward to, and it is basically addictive. And it becomes even more addictive when you actually do well. This was a particularly good day that took place at Virginia International Raceway a couple years ago with HSR. So I'm going to show this video, and I don't know what all these marks are. If anybody put them on there, if you can take them off, that'd be great. But I'm going to show this video, and you may need to actually use the URL that I sent to you because I just don't know what your connection is like. But I wanted to orient you before I did that. So on this kind of trace here, which is very hard to see, is a track map. And this happens to be Road America again. And this little yellow dot shows where you are on the track. This is reading off of that GPS antenna. Here's that speed readout and the lap timer as well. Here's the speedometer. These are actually artificially inserted by David after the session is done. It's an integration that is a major pain in the ass, to be truthful with you. It's really hard to get it right to coordinate with the video. We could spend several $1,000s more and make it easy, but, well, I guess I need to pay my crew more or something. Here's the tachometer. Sometimes it looks good and sometimes it doesn't. And then I have a rear camera as well. We actually have 5 video cameras, and we're usually using 2 of them at one time. And if David gets excited, he'll put one on the outside of the car. So there's a rear camera view here as well that is usually always on our videos. So let's see what this looks like, and I'm going to let it run, and then you can run your own. I chose that particular little segment for a couple reasons. One, it was perhaps one of the most exciting races that I've been able to do because I started at the back of the pack. And the story behind that is in racing, road racing we do, it's the faster cars that start in the front. Well, the day before, I blew up a motor. On Saturday morning, I blew up a motor. That particular video was on Sunday, September 16th, 2018. And it was in the morning, around 9 o'clock, that I lost the motor. And we were only 60 miles or 45 miles from home, so I made a decision to go home and got home around 11 o'clock in the morning. And by 10 o'clock at night, we had a new motor in the car. And the next morning at 5 o'clock in the morning, we were headed back to Road America. But because I didn't do any qualifying that day on Saturday, I had to start at the back of the pack. And truthfully, it was a lot of fun. I got to pass a lot of cars. I got to experience a lot of close racing, and I really did enjoy it. One of the other things I didn't mention, you may be wondering about the transmission. I'm running a Volvo modification of a transmission. It's made by a Volvo supplier called Home in Sweden, and it's a dog box. In other words, it has straight cut gears, no synchro meshes at all, and theoretically it can be shifted up and down without using the clutch. Well, on occasion I will upshift without the clutch because it's really fast. All I do is momentarily lift off the throttle and I can shift easily. I think Rob Keller is on here. He's got one of these things too. He's got more guts than I do though. He also downshifts without the clutch. I just haven't been able to bring myself to do that. So it's a very strong racing transmission. We're about 200 horsepower at the flywheel, and this transmission is rated for 600 horsepower. So we don't have any real worry about that. So that's the presentation that I have for you. If